sparsely inhabited, overgrown with nature. Welcome to the backwoods, a place where those ancient things stalk unimpeded by man. So, when the sound of human footsteps disturbs this domain, it might awaken something old, terrifying, and angry. These are allegedly true and scary backwoods stories. In this episode, I'm counting something as backwoods when it's set in remote forested land. Enjoy, and remember to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org. I'm looking for more not deer encounters. Also, send us your scary workplace experiences at eeriecast.com/submit. By the way, I was recently asked to do a quick voiceover for an independent film called The Hollow. So if you want to check it out and support some cool horror filmmakers, check out The Hollow on Amazon with the link in the description. Now, let's begin. Warning. The following story contains depictions of implied violence against pets. Dogman attacks home. From Cynotic. I'd like to start by saying I don't really know what I saw those years ago. These events happened sometime in the past, and memories can change. However, some aspects are clearer in my mind than others. I worry that my mind filled in the gaps of the events that happened those years ago. Nevertheless, this is the story of what happened during a winter of my youth. I lived in western Michigan, not too far from Lake Michigan, and in a deeply rural town. Fewer than 2,000 people reside in my hometown, and I lived some 20 minutes away from civilization. While there were few people, there were miles of rolling farmland and untamed forests that surrounded us, giving my father ample room to indulge his favorite hobby of hunting. I was never too interested in hunting myself. I felt it insulting to the majestic deer who lived on our property, and frankly unfair whenever guns were involved. This was just one of the many differences between my father and I. Still, he did his best to involve me in his hobbies. That's how, despite hours of protesting, I was dragged into the woods with him and up a tree after school. Wearing full camo and holding his rifle and binoculars, my father scanned the surrounding woods and fields for any sign of activity. I, on the other hand, was swaddled in a blanket and in a horribly uncomfortable lawn chair, not at all enjoying myself. While I loved the woods, and still do, I just wasn't interested in that evening's activities. I originally started scanning the path which we came from, wondering if I could see our home tucked past all those trees. "Son, stop squirming. Everything in the woods can hear you," my father said gruffly. I huffed in annoyance but listened, opening my book, trying to get comfortable. It was later in the year and the afternoon sun quickly turned to dusk. I'd lost track of time and only began to pay attention to my surroundings when I was going to complain to my dad that it was becoming too dark to read. Looking up, I realized he had fallen asleep. I was first filled with annoyance that I'd been brought to these cold, dark woods for my father's entertainment, only to have him fall asleep on me. But then a sudden mischievous curiosity overtook me. Binoculars, a rifle, among other treasures, were in front of me. My father's tools, which I was told never to touch, were within arm's length and for the taking. The gun was too intimidating. The binoculars, however, were too tempting to pass up on. These were high-powered and very expensive pieces of equipment, but I snatched them up and turned to see if I could finally see my house with their help. I searched through the countless tree branches and was about to give up when I saw movement. It was low to the ground, some dark brown furred animal that was shaking violently. I couldn't make out many details, and even though I saw antlers, it seemed unlike a deer. Deer were usually pretty calm and very distinguishable. I couldn't begin to guess what I was looking at, though I eventually noticed it was two things. One of them was dead, and another not so much. I quickly guessed that I was looking at two distinct creatures One a long-dead deer carcass, and some other animal that seemed to be dragging it through the woods. I have a habit of talking too much, and this came to bite me when I muttered, "What is that?" under my breath. The thing stopped moving suddenly. My heart skipped a beat as I kept looking at it. There's no way that thing had heard me. It was so far away. Yet I saw those long ears perk up, and it turned to show its face. It was a canine thing. Long snout that tapered into a dark nose, sharp yellowish teeth that jutted out at awkward angles, and the most peculiar eyes. While it seemed to not have hair or have very short hair around its face, the part that stuck out to me were the eyes. They were a deep amber color, unnaturally illuminated in the low light, and they seemed too aware to belong to an animal. Even though I had absolutely no idea what I was looking at, it deeply unsettled me. Some voice in my head, even as a child, screamed that this was not natural. And yet, I was transfixed. I kept staring at it. Eventually, the creature stood still. Then it turned to look up. I locked eyes, or binoculars, with this thing. It cocked its head slightly, and I was mesmerized by its cold gaze. With an unnatural grace, the hunched figure began to unfold itself, and I watched with disbelief as this canine entity began to stand on 2 feet. It was very tall, though how tall exactly I couldn't say. It was thin too. It looked emaciated, as I remember seeing rib bones through a thin-haired patch on its sides. The legs were bent at an awkward angle, and given how the creature hunched and held onto a tree trunk, I guessed that while it could stand up, it was one of the many unnatural aspects of the creature. I remember it was strange, and I dare to say it had hands. The paws were unnaturally shaped with these spindly fingers that jutted out and ended with long claws. The worst part of the whole event was just the sense of understanding. I had a primal feeling that this creature knew I was up in the trees looking at it, that it understood completely what was going on, and that it and I both knew it could come get me whenever it wanted. This sense of overwhelming dread eventually led my shaking hands to drop my father's binoculars. The sharp noise shook the quiet woods as the glass of the binocular frames broke below. That one sound seemed to set off a chain reaction. I began to violently shake and started shouting for my dad to wake up. "Dad, Dad, something's out there. We need to go home," I begged. To his credit, he quickly woke up and took control of the situation. I explained what I saw and pointed to the general direction it was in. He reached for his binoculars, and I sheepishly motioned to the ground. "Sorry." He scoffed and looked down the hill that happened to lead towards our home. The seconds dragged by slowly until he finally looked down at me. "It must have been a coyote. Whatever it was, it isn't there now." "Dad, it wasn't a coyote. I saw it." "You spooked yourself and nothing more," he said, cutting me off. He looked around the surrounding woods and rubbed some of the sleep out of his eyes. "Look, it's been long enough. Let's head back. Mom must be worried sick." "Dad, what if it's still out there?" I demanded, stepping away from the trapdoor that led towards the exit and the dangerous woods. "Just stop. Nothing's going to hurt you. Besides, I'll keep you safe," he said, motioning to his rifle. "Now, let's get home." There was no more pleading I could do, so I begrudgingly gave in. He went down the ladder first, and I quickly followed. I saw him shake his head when he saw the binoculars, and he picked up his ruined gear, beginning the walk back home. For me, it was an excruciating walk, and though my father tried making small talk, I was too worried. I scanned the trees and jumped at every sound. Thankfully, nothing stopped us, and we made it home safely. My father explained the events to my mother, and they both teased me for having an overactive imagination. I said nothing, and just thought over the brief encounter. Over the few weeks that went by between the first encounter and my second, I began to believe that I was just seeing things. My father never saw evidence of anything when he went on various other hunts, and I pushed the thoughts away. Eventually, I forgot about the incident, although its eyes always bothered me. Even after the fact, they always felt a little too human. Some weeks later, however, I would get another encounter with this thing, and that encounter would permanently change how I saw the previous events and the world around me. It was nearing Christmas, and we were no longer in school. My father was begrudgingly taking time from work to be with the family, and all was well. I remember that night it was particularly bright out, and sometime after dinner, our dogs began to act strange. We had a basset hound and a lab mix at the time, and both began to circle the outermost edges of the home, occasionally whining. At first, we thought it was a bit odd, but still charming seeing them gazing out the window, one a head taller than the other. After a couple of hours of this behavior, it went from cute to concerning. My mom and dad debated calling a vet, but eventually they ruled that it could wait until the morning. My father, the avid hunter, was excited to see if there was maybe a stray animal outside, so he took his rifle with him when he took the dogs outside to use the bathroom. I remember hearing some commotion, but I was honestly too engrossed in whatever video game I was playing at the time to care. Eventually, my father returned with our lab mix, Millie, but our basset, Walter, was nowhere to be found. This wasn't too unusual. The dogs had plenty of space to roam out here and would sometimes run off for hours. Their earlier behavior seemed to trouble my dad. "Mills never left my side," he said, pointing to our lab. "Walter just bolted, though." My mother and father tried calling for our missing dog, but to no avail. And eventually, we started to get ready for bed. It wasn't too cold just yet, and they figured he'd turn up sometime soon. Millie, however, became increasingly nervous. She continued to patrol the paths she was walking earlier in the day, though now she quickly crossed from window to window, as if trying to see everything at once. She wouldn't stop, and eventually my parents put her in their room, and we parted ways for the night. My room faced the dirt drive that eventually met with the road, and as such our porch was outside it. There were large windows in my room, and thick drapes that managed to keep the porch light out, yet you could see if something, usually bugs, passed underneath the lights. So as I settled into bed, I remember hearing strange sounds, like howling out in the distance that reminded me of the yowling noises coyotes would make. Still, it was fairly standard for Michigan nights. However, Molly began making this awful whining noise. It was so loud, I could hear it from my parents' bedroom on the other side of the house. Even though she eventually went silent, I went to check up on her and my parents, now worried for my dog. I don't remember what we talked about, but some time passed in my parents' room, and my mother led me back to my bed. I was watching the ground, very nearly asleep, while my mom prattled about this or that, until she suddenly stopped. Her hand gripped my shoulder tightly, and I looked up to ask her what was wrong. She just kept staring at the window, my window. Through the thick drapes, I could see a figure standing on our porch. It seemed to be trying to hide itself, tucked in the corner of the porch, yet its silhouette was plain for us to see. For a moment, it just stood there, until it seemed to lurch forward from a standing position to a crawl as it moved out of the window's borders. I immediately remembered that thing in the woods. I began to speak, but my mother shushed me with a finger to her mouth. She dragged me back to my parents' room. "Lee, something is outside of Keith's room," she said, voice clipped and still holding onto my shoulder. "What?" "Something or someone is outside Keith's room," she repeated. My father, who was originally smiling as if we were playing a prank on him, immediately sensed how serious she was. He nodded and went for the door. "Dial 911, but don't call unless something happens," he said. "I'm going to check it out." Then he quickly left the room. We just stood there. My mom finally let go of me and patted her pockets. "Dang it, I left my phone out in the kitchen," she said, her voice shaking. I was really young and didn't know what to do. I just stood there in the center of my parents' room waiting. You could hear my father slowly making his way through the house and the creak of what I assumed to be the gun cabinet opening. After what felt like ages, he finally came back, slowly opening the door. "Susan, I don't see anything," he began, when suddenly a booming, shaking sound filled the house. It sounded like something was trying to rip open our front door. These loud and irregular beating sounds filled the room, and my mom took me towards the floor with her. My father began to shout, "I've got a gun! This is private property!" But the banging didn't stop. It seemed to get almost more frequent. My mom was shaking while she held me. My father looked down. "Susan, call the cops!" "I left my phone in the other room," she said, panic in her voice. My father cursed and flung the door open. Our home was an open floor plan, so I could see the front door from my parents' room. There was a large figure standing on the other side of the glass, its massive bulk nearly filling the entire upper window on the door. Our firewood stove was near the front door, so the light from it and our porch light behind it helped keep the figure in darkness. My father marched towards the door, raising his gun. My mother suddenly ran into the kitchen and got her phone. I stood there alone in the room. I heard my mother frantically calling 911 while my dad approached the door and eventually fired. Even through the bashing at the front door and the shrill cries of my mother, the gunshot echoed in the house. There was a loud groaning noise from the other side of the door, then the figure quickly left. I stood frozen, just watching the whole event unfold. "Susan, let's get in the basement and wait for the cops there," my dad yelled, keeping his eyes on the front door. I heard my mother giving our address and saw her walk towards me. She grabbed me by the elbow and looked past me towards the back of the bedroom and the windows. I remember her screaming in my ear and dragging us towards the basement. I never got to see what it was that made her scream. As we raced down the stairs, my mother shakily finished her conversation with the operator. "There are bears outside. Please send help. They're trying to get in." I remember my mother and I huddled in a corner, and my father keeping a trained eye and his rifle pointed at the door to the basement. The rest seems a blur. In hindsight, I don't handle stress very well. I just remember sitting there with my family for quite some time until eventually the police came. They spoke with my mother and father, and my father walked with them outside. I wasn't allowed to go with them out of the house, but the next day I remember seeing the damage to the door. There were these long gash marks all across the wood, and it seemed to be bowed in a strange way. My father thinks we're lucky. The heat from the wood stove warped the frame of the door so much that we hadn't been able to open it in years. We always used the back door. The police agreed that something that determined probably would have made its way inside had it not been for the extra support. They never found anything outside that night. They made comments about strange markings on the ground, but snow began to fall. I remember walking around the house the next day. Our family friends were there seeing the damage. I only heard snippets of the conversation between my parents and their friends. Bear was brought up frequently, though no one could agree. Walter, our basset hound, was considered missing for a couple of weeks. Eventually, said family friends found him. I was told he drowned, and they wouldn't say anything else on the matter. To this day, I don't know what really happened. I asked my mother about the event years later and only got a grim smile and some deflecting conversation. I know she would rather put everything behind us and pretend it could never happen. Sometimes I wish I could too. Codejo, Black Shuck, or Demon. From Devil Dog 4200. When I was roughly 6 or 7 years old, up until I was 9, my family lived in a single-wide 1940s model trailer in the boonies. The trailer had an open 5-acre yard with southeast Georgia woods surrounding it. Every day after school, my brother and I would spend the day until dark playing outside with toy guns or bicycles. We mostly stayed out of trouble as long as we weren't in the house during the day and back inside before dark. The first experience I can remember clear enough to recall, I had just gotten out of the shower. I'm 23 now and I believe I was 7 back then, but my memory is hazy. When I opened the shower curtain, I saw a blur rush by the doorway of the bathroom into my parents' room. I just brushed it off as our dog, since it was lower to the ground. But when I left the bathroom and turned toward my room, it felt as though something rushed close up behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there. Skip ahead to the winter of that year. Things began to progress. At various times, I would get the feeling of being watched, or I would hear unintelligible whispers. My sister felt it as well. These small occurrences went on for a few months. From there, it began to rapidly get worse. One day during summer, it all changed from small whispers and feelings to full apparitions and poltergeist activity. For most of the day, nothing much happened until after dark. I just got my shower. Funny how these things repeat. Instead of a blur by the door, there was a loud bang on the wall from my parents' room. I assumed maybe something fell, so I got dressed and started to leave the room. As I turned into the hall with my back turned to my parents' room, I heard a deep, slow inhale. Almost like someone was breathing in a really good smelling candle. It stopped me in my tracks, and I didn't dare move. The next thing I heard sent me sprinting to my mother in the living room in sheer panic. A deep voice groaned.
"The young, the tender."
The following night, I was lying in bed trying to sleep when the usual whispers began. Only this time, there were way more than just a couple of voices. I opened my eyes, and there were these humanoid shadows just kind of floating all over the walls and ceiling. They didn't emanate any bad feelings, but rather a feeling of safety and comfort. I watched these strange shadow figures for at least an hour before they faded away. Once the last one was gone, the atmosphere around immediately changed. It became difficult to breathe. The air seemed to breed fear, and unease filled the room. I heard shuffling coming from my parents' room. It was like a combination of claws from a dog's paws on a hardwood floor and goat hooves. As these sounds started to make their way down the hall, I completely covered myself under my blankets up to my eyes. These footsteps continued up to my doorway, then abruptly stopped. For seconds that felt like hours, there was dead silence, until I heard that familiar deep inhale. My entire body was petrified. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could do nothing. After a few moments of listening to this thing's breathing, I noticed the shadow figures began to appear, but they all had white circles where the eyes should have been. As I watched the figures, I noticed movement outside the doorway. When I looked, there was a canine head moving down the hall. It stopped halfway past my doorway and lingered there. This thing was mostly canine-looking, almost like solid black Doberman, only its head, while on all fours, reached the light switch. I now know that light switch was a little over 4 feet off the ground. On its head were a pair of horns like a mountain goat or ram, curling back behind its ears and ending at its jawline. The beast suddenly turned, stood up on its hind legs leaning towards my room, and stared at me with eyes like embers in a fire. As it started to lean into my room, I could hear its breathing quicken, and I could see its maw start dripping with drool. Once it breached the threshold of my room, the shadow figures began to gather closer around the beast. This seemed to anger it, and it backed off, remaining in the hallway just staring at me. That thing and the shadow figures remained until the sun began to shine through the trees outside. This would happen every night around the same time. The thing would never physically attack me, and eventually I grew to believe it couldn't. We moved out of that trailer in December of 2009. A couple of months before that, I learned that it could in fact touch me if it wanted to. I was sitting in my parents' room while my mom was folding and putting away my dad's laundry. I had an old carry-around CD player with my earbuds in, listening to 3 Days Grace. Once my mom finished, she went to my grandparents' house for something that I can't remember. I remained there, sitting on the edge of my parents' bed, jamming to my music. I noticed it felt as if the mattress behind me was sinking down and going back up. Being used to things like this happening, I ignored it. The movement behind me continued until it was on either side of me. Suddenly, I felt a breath on the top of my head as my CD player was ripped from my hands and smashed on the floor. Before I could react, I heard a deep, guttural growl. Then I was pushed hard into the wall towards the doorway. To clarify any confusion on the doorway and why we didn't close the doors, it was because there were no rooms inside the trailer with a door. I rushed outside and waited for my mom to get back, shaking and pouring tears. She figured whatever I was listening to had scared me, and that I had tripped and smashed my CD player. That maybe I heard the growl because I scared the dog, even though he was outside when this incident occurred. Later that night, she found deep scratches in my back and assumed it was the dog. Unfortunately, they refused to believe me, so my dad got rid of the dog when he came home. Once we moved out, all of these occurrences abruptly halted, save for some whispers and things being moved, but nothing more than that. I never saw the entities again. However, when you walked by the trailer as it was on my grandparents' property, you could sometimes make out a canine figure through one of the windows or hear strange sounds from inside, but I never saw it outside the trailer. Since then, I've served a 4-year term in the Marines. When I got out and returned home, I learned that my family tore down and buried the old trailer. Every now and then, I or my brother have noticed or glimpsed that same figure stalking the tree line or following us on the property from a distance, as if biding its time, looking for the opportune moment to make its move. I've never been able to find out what this thing or the shadow figures were. My brother claims it looks like how some cadejos are described, but I haven't found any with horns, and I believe they followed tired travelers. I lean towards a black shuck or demonic entity. As far as the shadow figures, I have no clue. If any of you know anything about these things, or can find anything out about them, don't hesitate to let me know. Torment, from Airborne Sapper. What I'm about to tell you still chills me to my core to this very day. I am a soldier in the United States Army, and I'm from Eustis, Maine. I've had a few creepy and just eerie encounters with an unknown creature. It started back in 2014 when I was a freshman in high school. It was a cold October night. My older brother Richie and I had just left the local haunted hayride at a campground near our house. We were walking back at 9 p.m. at night, and mind you, we live on top of a ridge about 1.5 miles from where we were at the moment. After walking for a little while, we reached our road. It was hard to miss. It sat next to a chapel and 2 graveyards. The road itself was tar and turned to dirt at the top of the ridge. There were no lights on this road except the bright moonlight. We crossed the road and began our long trek up the ridge. Personally, I enjoy nature. It's very comforting to me listening to the birds and the squirrels and the music of wildlife. But that night was different. We were about halfway up the hill when everything just went dead quiet. A large chill ran up my spine, and the hair on my arms and neck stood up on end. Richie, on the other hand, wasn't really bothered by it, I don't know if it was bravery or stupidity. I kept walking until I heard a large branch in the surrounding woods snap. I can still hear it to this day. When I heard it, I jumped a little bit, but I couldn't see much of anything. There was just this all-consuming void of darkness looking back at me, as if it was going to swallow me up. As my brother and I pressed on, I couldn't help but notice that it sounded like something was keeping pace with us in the woods. I didn't dare stop. I knew Richie wasn't going to. He didn't really care about me, him being the older brother. When we got to the dirt portion, I couldn't hear anything anymore. Whatever it was seemed to be gone. And my brother and I finally made it home. My next encounter didn't happen until 3 years later, around late December in 2017. Richie, our friend Johnny, and I had just finished a fire department meeting. It was around 10:45 at night, and we decided to drive down to the lake. We were joking around, having fun. Those two were smoking cigarettes. Then we all started making noises, intending them to be Bigfoot mating calls just to have fun. But then, out of nowhere, something just came crashing through the woods towards us. Johnny threw me in the back seat of the truck, and my brother got in the driver's seat. We peeled out of there as fast as we could, without crashing the truck. My final encounter didn't happen until mid-November of 2018, during deer season. Every time I talk about this one, I still tear up. I had just left my house. It was high noon, and I was armed with a .30-30 lever-action rifle and a knife on my hip. I walked up behind my neighbor's house on an ATV trail. Around this time, it's usually dead quiet, as the woods are just full of hunters. I was tracking down a pair of deer. I was close behind as the prints were still fresh in the mud. I followed them up behind my neighbor's hunting cabin. Eventually, I came up to a big holler, and I caught sight of the pack. There was no wind, no noise, nothing at all. I'd gotten a good vantage point behind a tall birch to look at the deer. Then all of them froze and looked up in the direction where I just came from, and they took off like something had them. I looked over where they were looking before, but the forest was too thick for me to see much of anything. I was about to continue tracking when I heard something that was scarred right into my memory. I heard this terrible scream. It didn't sound human, but it was certainly big. It sounded at least 70 meters away. I was shaken, and I tried to get out of there as quiet and quick as I could. Not 30 seconds later, I heard the scream again, but it was much closer. Too close for comfort. So I said screw it, and I took off as fast as I could. There was a dirt road about 50 meters away that led back to my house, so I got to it, and I didn't stop until I got back to my house. I didn't hear it behind me giving chase or anything. I think it just wanted me out of there. After that, I never went to that spot again. I spoke of the encounter to my mother. She said it was probably just a deer or something. It's 2022 now, and just a couple of weeks ago, I talked about it with my wife. She believed it could be a skinwalker or a wendigo. I think it could be a wendigo. I live on Native American lands. To this day, I research cryptids in hopes that I'll find what it is and how to kill it. That brings us to the end of this episode of Darkness Prevails. More terrifying stories are on the way soon, so subscribe and smash that like button. By the way, did you know this show is available as a podcast called Unexplained Encounters? Just search for, follow, and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. This show is part of the EerieCast network. Go to EerieCast.com for more scary podcasts, such as Freaky Folklore, which explores your favorite monsters, myths, and mysteries, as well as Redwood Bureau, a fictional horror podcast about an agent on the run from an evil secret organization that captures supernatural creatures and entities. Well, thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.